I just returned home from a business trip out of state, and it was by far the weirdest experience of my life. A few years ago, when I was in college, I'd met this guy in one of my classes. He was sitting in the back of the classroom next to the only open seat available. I sat down and he introduced himself. He told me that his name was Chris. Although I wasn't in a particularly talkative mood, Chris had this strange charisma about himself that made speaking with him rather engaging. We chatted for a little while, and before I knew it, the bell had rung. We both said our goodbyes and headed off to our other classes. The following days, Chris and I would sit next to each other and spend the majority of the class just talking about whatever. The more I spoke with him, the more I began to realize just how similar we were. We had the same sense of humor, the same interests, the same likes and dislikes. It was kind of unsettling just how much alike we were. It was almost as if we had been friends since grade school. I suppose it just goes to show that the world isn't as big as we like to think. About halfway through the term, the holidays were fast approaching. Chris told me he was heading back home to visit his family for vacation. This took me by surprise, as I was sure he was going to tell me that he lived in the house right next door to mine. He said he lived in a small town 2 states over and that he was just here for school. I knew people traveled all over the country for higher education, it just never crossed my mind that he was one of them. Eventually, the school year ended. Chris and I had separate classes from that point forward, so we saw very little of each other. We still kept in touch through social media and the like, but we hadn't really spoken face to face for some time. During my 3rd year in college, Chris found me in the halls and told me that he was heading back home. He wished me all the best and told me that if I was ever in his town, to look him up. I thanked him for the kind offer and wished him a safe journey home. Fast forward a bit. I had graduated college, gotten my degree, and had gotten a job working as a consultant for a tech company. For the most part, my job was just basically traveling from city to city, stopping at all of the subsidiaries and branches, making sure everything was up to code. While the traveling could be very monotonous at times, overall, I really enjoyed it. I got to travel across the country visiting all the major metropolitan cities. I probably wouldn't have even left my own state if it wasn't for this job. Not to mention the pay was rather nice as well. About a month ago, I had received my next location. It was for a city I hadn't been to, but when I looked it up, I remember that Chris told me he had lived not too far away from there. So, before my trip, I contacted him and asked him what he was up to. After a few minutes of catching up, I told him about my job and that it would be taking me through his state. He told me that I had to swing by and that he wouldn't take no for an answer. Usually when I travel, my job gives me quite a bit of time to take care of everything I need to before I have to fly back home. Apparently, the person who held this job before me took a while completing assignments, so the company compensated for it by extending his travel time. Whether intentional or not, that was actually a huge bonus for me, as I've often completed the job within a day or two, then fly back when I'm required. This gives me quite a bit of free time to see the sights and do basically whatever. After flying into the city in the morning, I quickly rented a car and drove directly to the main office. I spoke with the senior manager for a bit before they put me in a side office with a laptop and a few boxes. By the end of the workday, I had completed my entire inspection, typed up my report, and left. I was going to get a hotel for the duration, but during my talk with Chris, he told me to just stay at his place free of charge. I mulled it over while I was in the midst of paperwork and decided why the hell not. I texted him and he gave me his address shortly after. It was nearly a 2-hour drive out to his town, but that didn't bother me in the slightest. After all, I had nothing better to do. As I drove along, I noticed how rural the scenery quickly became. The transition between the large city and the sparsely populated countryside was night and day. By the time I reached Chris's town, the sun had already partially set. It took me a bit of time to find the correct house, even with my GPS helping me out. All of the houses in this area looked identical, like they were all part of some sort of weird subdivision. Upon finding the correct house, I walked up and knocked. A minute later, I was greeted by Chris. He welcomed me with open arms and I entered. Although Chris was the nicest guy you'd ever meet, I did have the thought in the back of my mind that he might actually be a serial killer. Looking around his house, though, put me at ease. His house was the epitome of the phrase bachelor pad. Movie posters and various sports memorabilia adorned his walls. He had a giant TV and a fridge stocked with all sorts of beer. We spent the evening drinking and watching old sports recaps on his TV. Then, after a couple of hours, he told me he was getting tired. He showed me to the guest bedroom and bid me goodnight. Surprisingly, I slept peacefully throughout the night. Then, at around 6 o'clock in the morning, I was awoken to the sound of sirens echoing from outside. They weren't police or ambulance sirens, they were different. They sounded like some sort of severe weather warning system. The sound carried across the entire town. I tiredly cracked open my eyes and looked around, forgetting where I was momentarily. Then a second later, I heard the front door open and close. Curious, I got out of bed and walked over to his front door myself. As I did, I passed by his large living room window, and I froze in my tracks. I turned and I couldn't believe what I was seeing. There were people. A lot of people. All just standing there a few feet away from their houses. They all seemed to be standing very rigidly. The posture was very militaristic. I had absolutely no idea what was going on. I stared with my jaw nearly on the floor for 20 minutes. Then, suddenly, all of the people turned around and entered their homes. My eyes snapped to the front door and I saw Chris walk in. He greeted me with a surprised good morning, and I just returned a nervous wave. Throughout the morning, he didn't say anything regarding what took place. He just went about the day as if it never happened. I thought about bringing it up, but I wasn't entirely sure how to. We hung out for the rest of the day, and while that sight was very odd, it lasted only a brief moment, and nothing seemed to come of it. I tried to rationalize it in my head. Like, it would be no different than people going out to get the morning paper at the same exact time, then standing out there for 20 minutes without moving. Yeah, no different at all. Regardless, I tried not to let what happened get to me. Instead, I put it in the back of my mind and relaxed a bit. That was until 6 p.m. rolled around. The sun was already setting when I heard that same familiar siren echo in the distance. I looked over to Chris, who was sitting adjacent to me, and I playfully asked him what that noise was. He looked back at me with an expression I hadn't seen him make before. Chris, who was normally all smiles and sunshine, turned to me with a look absent of emotion, like his mind had been wiped clean. He stood up from his chair, walked over to the door, and stepped outside. Curious as to what was going on, I got up and followed him out of the door. I walked towards Chris, while simultaneously keeping an eye on all the other people who were now standing outside. I stepped in front of him and looked him directly in the eyes. What were previously bright blue eyes were now a dark shade of black. I could feel a chill running down my spine. I quietly made my way back into the house, and a few minutes later, Chris entered and asked me if I wanted another beer. In that moment, I confronted him, asking him why he and the other townsfolk stand outside their houses at 6 in the morning and at night. He just returned a bewildered look and asked me what I meant. I told him what I saw, and he just said that he hadn't gone outside at all today. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I told Chris that I was probably just tired and that I needed to head to bed before heading back to work the next day. He asked me if I was sure, and I nodded. Well, he didn't understand what I was talking about earlier. He said it was a shame that I had to go, but that he understood. The next morning, I woke up very early and packed my stuff. When I threw my bag into my car and was getting ready to leave, I heard those sirens once again. I turned to look, and all of the people slowly began funneling out of their homes like zombies. What's weird is that while I sat in my car watching, I had this twinge in the back of my mind to go outside and do the same, like a voice beckoning me to come outside. I shook the thought from my head and drove back to the city. I have never experienced anything like that in all my life. During my flight back home, I decided to write this out because every time I try to recollect what happened, the memory just seems fuzzier and fuzzier, like a dream that you forget the more you try to remember. I haven't spoken to Chris since then, and I'm not sure if I'm going to again. I don't know what those sirens are, or why the people seem to be brainwashed to stand outside. But one thing's for sure. The next time I hear random sirens echoing in a town, I'm not sticking around to find out why.